Hello everyone, welcome to a new chess video. Welcome to the hyper-modern opening, an opening that might seem a bit defensive, but at the same time is the most aggressive of all. It's going to help you surprise your opponent and will also help you win a ton of games. Check out what a strange move to start with. B3. Notice that we're ignoring the most natural moves, which are about occupying the center, and we're playing B3 because it has some devilish ideas. So I'm going to explain absolutely all of them to you so you can win a ton of games. Notice that here, black has several ideas to respond to the move B3. What are the most common ones? E5 or D5, occupying the center. So let's look at all of them, starting with E5. When they play e5 against us, we're going to take advantage of this gap here to place our bishop on b2, and by the second move, we'll already be attacking their pawn that they developed on their first move, so they'll have to defend it. Obvious move, right? Knight to c6. If they attack my pawn, I defend it with the knight. A rarer move would be d6, because we'd be blocking this dark squared bishop. So knight to c6, we can all agree that's a very obvious move. Let's continue with the move e3, a normal developing move to keep working with our bishop. Notice that we don't play e4. I'll explain later why it's better for us to play this pawn to e3 so we can even support a d4 in the future. And here, black can expand with d5. And notice that they've managed to get a good center, and it looks like they control the center of the board. Now we'll make a super useful move, which is bishop to b5. Notice that it seems like a pretty natural move, but be careful. If I asked you what you would do here with the black pieces, I'm sure a lot of you would say, I'd block the pin with the bishop, or even chase this bishop away from here. Since this is a position we don't usually play, notice that this would already be a huge mistake. Yes, if they put this bishop here, after the knight exchange, we're removing the defender of the pawn, and we'd already have an extra pawn in just 5 moves. So the black pieces would already be practically at a disadvantage. The same thing happens if they play this move here. After the exchanges, we capture here, and we'd end up with a pawn advantage. So notice that. Be careful. This move is more dangerous than it looks. You can't play or block with the bishop, nor come over here. So you have to play a move like bishop to d6, defending this point that's under attack. Because, like we said, first of all, with a move like this, we could also pretty much capture, well, not directly right now, but you see, with a move like this, that's what I mean. This knight is pinned, so it can't be moved. Like I said, bishop to d6 is a must-play move. If they don't play it, they immediately give us the advantage. Notice how powerful this line is. It might not seem like it, but both of our bishops are active from the very beginning, which gives us a lot of flexibility. How can we continue here? Well, we're going to keep attacking this pawn on e5, the weak point in their position. Now, you have to be careful. A move like pushing forward could allow the bishop to come in. This bishop is very dangerous. And let me tell you, a lot of people don't pay attention to it, especially in blitz games, to this bishop, and they play a totally normal move like this one and end up hanging this pawn here. So you have to be careful. Most likely, they'll notice and defend this pawn if they don't want to lose it. So the most common move is for them to play queen e7 to defend his pawn. How should we continue in this position? Well, we're simply going to play c4. There's also a move d4, which is very interesting too, but here we'd be blocking the diagonal and letting them attack our knight. So I suggest c4, a super interesting move with several objectives. The main goal, obviously, is to capture this pawn here, which is undefended. And also, notice that this knight would end up pinned and attacked by the pawn, so it's a tricky position. But it also threatens a possible advance a little later on, which we're about to make. So, after this threat, black is pretty much forced to capture. We're going to recapture with the pawn. Why? Because this way, we control this square, and this bishop doesn't have to move from this good square where it's pinning the knight. How can we continue the game from here? Let's see. Black has to keep developing their pieces. Right now, a very, very natural move would be knight to f6, as we can see. Why? Because it supports the center, and it also opens up the possibility to castle, so it would probably be the most popular move, or the one most of you would make. And here is the reason we mentioned for the move c5. Notice that with a move like c5, black is forced to capture because this bishop has no squares to go to, so they're forced to capture if they don't want to lose it. Once they capture this pawn here, this pawn is no longer defended. It was being protected by the bishop, and now we're attacking it with two pieces, while they're only defending it with the queen. So we come in through here and pay attention to the pressure we're putting on this knight. It's a huge amount of pressure. They have to block, obviously, otherwise after a few exchanges, they'd start losing pieces. Look, here the pawn would fall and the rook would go too. So this is very dangerous. They have to defend with their bishop on the d7 square, and we simply trade off this bishop with the knight, and the pin remains. We have a very, very good position. It looks like a totally normal and balanced position, but it's actually very advantageous for us, and I'm going to show you how to continue. First, let's quickly evaluate the position. We maintain a very strong pin. Why? Because even though the queen is in the middle, a queen can also be the target of a pin, right? This knight can't move because we have a brutal pin. This bishop is a beast, but this bishop is even more of a beast. Notice that it's on the longest diagonal of the board, and there are no pawns blocking this diagonal, so it's a devilish bishop. It's attacking this square. This queen has options both here, where it would be attacking this square and this one, and also here, adding more pressure to the pin. Even in the future, if they castle short, we can trade here and bring the queen in, which we'll see in a moment. So, what's the evaluation of the position? It's a position that's equal in material, but not in quality. Why's that? Because we have two bishops that are absolute beasts, and we have threats, while our opponent doesn't have any threats available. So, I'm going to show you how to take advantage of this edge. We castle here, and now black has the option to castle either long or short. Notice that both of these positions look pretty solid for both sides. Let's learn how to fight against both options. If they castle long, what move do we have? We have a move like queen to a4, which increases the pressure on the pin. So now this queen can't just leave so easily. If it does, we can make a series of exchanges and come out ahead. So this queen isn't going anywhere, and we're also putting more pressure on this point. We also have a rook that can come in through the open c-file, attacking this bishop. And when it moves, it will also be attacking this knight. And after the exchanges, we would come out ahead again. So if they castle long, we would have all these options. I recommend queen to h4, and the pressure would be brutal. So if they castle short, how could we continue the attack? Alright, pay attention, because this is how I like to carry out the attack. We trade this bishop for the knight. This way, we open up their castling position completely. They're forced to capture, because otherwise they've obviously lost a piece. And when they open up, I come in with the queen from the other side. Notice too that our pawn structure has always been really solid. We've just played this pawn here and this pawn there, so it's hard for them to find any weaknesses. That's the thing with the b3 opening. It's actually better than it looks. We come in with the queen, we're attacking the bishop, even though it might not look like we're attacking the bishop, and when the bishop moves, we could play this move here. What for? Well, notice that we're threatening a possible knight pin, but if they try to stop us, it doesn't matter. Whatever they do, we go bishop to d3, and the threat is completely unstoppable. There's no way to stop checkmate on the next move. The only way would be to give up the queen, then we'd deliver checkmate on the next move. Well, this first explanation is probably already convincing you that this move is pretty interesting. I'm going to show you another line you need to know. Pay close attention to this video because it's going to be super thorough. You're going to finish this video as a pro in this line. Plus, I'm going to show you later how to play it with the black pieces. So if you want more content like this, subscribe to the channel and give it a big like because I'm really putting a lot of effort into this video. Let's keep looking at how this line works. After bishop 3, we were analyzing the move e5. If you remember, after the move e5, we had to play bishop to b2. Wanna? Because this way, right from the start, we begin attacking. We attack with the bishop at the e5 square. and black has to defend. Oh, we've seen that we're not going to cover the move d6 in this video for now because it's a much worse move and it traps the bishop. Let's look at the best move, the one most people play against you. Otherwise, the video would end up being 3 hours long. I can cover that in future videos. Let's look at the move knight to c6. Well, after the move c6, we also saw how we should respond. E3. Why E3? To maintain a good pawn structure and, in the future, maybe support a possible d4. So E3 is an essential move. And after d5, taking control of the center, we'd bring the other bishop out to pin this knight. Super important. Once the knight is pinned, remember, they have to defend this pawn, because otherwise we're going to capture it. What happens when they defend this pawn? We keep attacking it. I mentioned in the first line what happens if they play e5 against us. The honest truth is, this line is significantly more complicated than it seems at first glance, so let's analyze it quickly, because if someone plays it against you, you need to know how to react appropriately. Notice that this is a deadly move. We're attacking the rook, and in fact, we're going to win it. So they have to capture this knight if they don't want to lose the rook outright. We capture the rook, but watch out, because they can come in here and attack our rook as well. This rook has to move over here, and be careful, because they also have to defend this pawn. A lot of you are probably thinking, what happens if they capture this pawn here, and also attack our rook? Well, we would simply capture this pawn, attacking the bishop, and also attacking this knight. So in this case, black would be completely lost. Therefore, this pawn can't be captured, in case many of you were thinking about it. What you can do, though, is defend this pawn. And be careful, because we have a pawn on the second rank. It's true that we have a material advantage, of rook for a knight. We're up in material, but still, be careful, because there's a dangerous pawn and things could get tricky for us. Now, they really are threatening to come in over here. So, watch out. We have to play precisely. First, let's bring out our queen. Check out what an interesting move this is. Attacking this bishop and also targeting this spot right here. So here, black has to defend this bishop if they don't want to lose it. Alright, once that's done, be careful because they're still threatening bishop takes pawn. If they're threatening bishop takes pawn, the first thing we need to do is trade off this knight. Here, some people might make a mistake and capture with the queen. In that case, we win the bishop and end up gaining even more material. But if they don't make a mistake, the right move is obviously to capture with the pawn. And they keep defending this bishop here. And on top of that, they damage their pawn structure. So how do we save this? Well, now that we've successfully eliminated the knight, we carefully retreat the bishop back, place it on e5, and effectively neutralize the bishop that wants to get to a2. So here we end up with a significant material advantage, and the attack from the black pieces has been completely neutralized and eliminated. Now let's go back to this position, which is the critical position that most of our games will reach, where we're attacking this point with two pieces. We've seen what happens when they defend it with the queen, and we've seen what happens when they play e5 against us. A lot of you will ask, what happens if they play f6? It seems like a very solid and strong move, but in practice it's not that good, since it gives us some great attacking opportunities. And I'm going to show you how to continue. Pay close attention to this continuation. Now, let's play. Whoa, where you going, Darn? We're going to play d4. Notice that I mentioned some to you earlier. We played e3 because in some cases we could even break through with d4. It seems like a very solid idea. Pay attention to this. By playing f6, you've weakened all your pieces, all the white squares. You need to know one thing. Every pawn move creates a weakness. The pawn defends these two squares. Once you move it, those two squares will never be defended by that pawn again, because a pawn is the only piece that can't move backwards. Therefore, a move like f6, which might seem good in practice, is actually a pretty dangerous move to make. We've played d4 here, and now black has several options. It's true that they could capture, but capturing wouldn't be a good idea, because we could even capture with the queen, since we could take advantage of this pin from the bishop on the knight, and they'd be weakening their position even more. Pay attention, because this knight can't get out through here. The king is left pretty exposed, so we'd have a very comfortable position. Is it advisable to exchange this pawn as black? No. Is it advisable to advance to attack this knight? Well, this already seems much more interesting, since now we've trapped our own bishop. And so trapping this fianchettoed bishop behind our pawn chain seems like an ideal option. What happens here is that they're actually helping us reposition our knight to d2. We play knight from f to d2. Why? Because now we are, well, it's true. We've pulled the knight back for a moment, but it also helps us provide extra support to the c4 square. It really seems like we're putting a lot of pressure here. With a developing move like knight from g to e7 by black, we could then follow up with c4 on our side, creating some really dangerous and immediate threats. Here, we're threatening to capture along the pin, or even bring the knight in first. So here, black might say, watch out, this threat is starting to get serious, and come over here to try to force us to trade this bishop for this knight. But this is a huge mistake. We trade here, and it's true that now they have to maintain the pawn chain, or rather, they have to break the pawn chain in order to later keep it, because if they capture with the knight, we would capture here. So they have to capture with the pawn. And now they think that if we capture here, they would keep the pawn chain. But with a move like c5, this bishop is completely trapped. It can't go back and it can't go forward because our pawn chain is locking it in. That's why you have to be really careful when advancing the pawn. If here you're not able to make the best moves, or on the other hand, your opponent is always able to find the solution, you shouldn't worry. Why? Because we have absolutely massive pressure in the center, a really strong position. This knight can come out via c3, putting a ton of pressure on. We can even castle. We could even trade this bishop that's trapped in our pawn chain for their bishop on d6, which looks like an incredibly powerful bishop. So we have some pretty clear plans. We could even trade here and castle, and you wouldn't have any problems. You don't have to remember everything. We have a really good position. We've studied pretty thoroughly what happens when they respond with e5. We've seen that we had a lot of attacking chances, and I'm sure you really liked it. Now let's see what happens or how they react if they play d5 against us, because that's just as interesting, if not more. When they play d5 instead of e5, we're going to do the same thing. That's why it's so easy to remember. We'll just bring out our bishop. Now they can't play e5 anymore, so that's something we've already gained. It could be that, for example, they play c5, just to give an example. That would be a very logical move. Why? Because they'd be controlling the center with their pawns. Since they can't play e5, they can play c5. Like I said, they can play a lot of other things. Here, a move like this could already open up the opponent's pawns directly, so they might want to avoid that. And honestly, the most common thing is for them to play c5 to take advantage of the center. If you've been paying attention to the first part of the video, you'll know that here, a very common move is e3. For the same reason as before, we're going to let this bishop out. We're waiting for them to play knight to c6 so we can pin it. I'm sure a lot of you already saw that coming. We're just waiting for them to play knight to c6 so we can bring the bishop over and pin it. If they play anything else, we just keep developing. Knight over here. We can even play d3 and bring the knight out this way so we don't block things up. But we're waiting for them to play knight to c6 so we can bring our knight out this way. They might block the pin, which would make a lot of sense, and we would just calmly keep developing our pieces. Careful, because here they might say, "Get out of here, bishop, you're bothering me." This doesn't worry us at all, because what's our idea? To trade this bishop for the knight. That's our main idea. If they play h6, it's almost like they're giving us a free move, because after the exchanges, it's true we've given up the bishop pair, but now we could bring our knight in through e5. Notice that we're going to get this bishop back no matter what. If it comes here, we can capture it. If it goes here, we can come around this way and still capture it. So this bishop is going to be recovered. We're not worried about having lost the bishop pair. What's a very typical move here? Well, it would be queen to c7, because since they're going to lose the bishop again anyway, at least this way they don't get doubled pawns and their pawn structure isn't damaged. But we don't want to capture the bishop, and I'll tell you why. Because this knight on d5 is just too strong to trade off right now. So we continue with our game, we castle calmly, and here black can continue, for example, with e6 to develop their bishop and knight. And here, we'll make a move that's very useful in these positions when they play d5 against us. This move is f4, and I'm going to explain why this move is so powerful. First, because it supports our best piece. It supports the d4 square, our super powerful knight. Right now, we've also opened up these lines to bring the queen and rook into the attack. So, let's keep going with our attack and our plan. Knight to f6 could be a totally normal move here. Are we going to trade here? No, we're going to play, for example, d3 to make way for our knight. This plan is important. Don't develop the knight over here because we block the bishop, and that doesn't help us. We play d3 to bring our knight through. They can keep developing, for example, with bishop to d6, and what we can do is knight to d2. Like I said, developing our pieces in a normal way without taking too many risks. And be careful, because once our opponent castles here, that's when we really get to work, and the attack can be devastating. Notice that this queen can come in through here, she can even come in via e1 and then g3, or she could even come in through h4. This queen is dangerous. This rook could do the same, either through here or here. So be careful because we be in a really brutal line. In fact, in this position, we're already completely winning. And I'm going to show you, for example, a line in this position to win quickly with an almost forced sequence. We take the bishop on c6 with the knight. After the capture, we take, and now, yes, the knight on f6, the only defender of the castling, and when they capture it, we bring the queen into the attack. Queen to h5, putting pressure on this point here. And what's our plan? Bring the rook here, and checkmate would be completely unstoppable. There's only one way to stop this checkmate, and even then, black's pieces would still be lost. The idea is to bring the king here, because now when we advance the rook, this rook can come over here and would come to defend. Notice that here it would come to defend, but if they bring the rook here to carry out this plan, they're simply leaving their pawns unprotected. We could come in through here, and we could come back around this way. We're attacking this pawn, and we're attacking this other pawn. Notice that now we're coming in through here. Check. They have to defend this pawn. We take the other one. We have two pawns up and a completely winning position. And notice something super important. We've gained material, and our attacking position remains intact. We still have our pieces attacking. We can bring in the other rook. We can bring in the knight. This is our plan. It might seem like b3 isn't aggressive, but it's actually very aggressive. Let's see what happens if now the black pieces are played by an expert player. What happens if they play the best moves against us? We have to be prepared for the best. Simply put, when they play d5 against us, which seems to be the best move of all, since by playing bishop to b2 we're not attacking any pawn, here black is not going to play c5. Why? Because that would give us the direct option to bring the bishop over here, and they wouldn't have the move c6 to cover this square. Therefore, for example, the move knight to f6 could follow. This move would be much more standard. Earlier, we said we could go for this exchange, but I'm going to recommend another line that's much better. Let's continue our development with e3. Let's just keep going as we normally would. And here, black could play more solidly with a move like e6, not leaving any gaps or weaknesses that would allow us to launch easy attacks. We continue with knight to f3, a completely natural move. And as we mentioned, here black isn't going to play c5 because that would let us bring in our bishop. Now, if we were to bring in our bishop, they would simply play c6 and be completely solid. So black doesn't want to play that here. However, they can play a move like bishop to e7, a much more natural move, bishop e7, a normal, straightforward development that I also recommend when playing as black. And here, we're going to change the plan a little bit. We're going to play c4. Now what we're going to do is undermine this center here. A move like c4, notice that after the exchanges, we could bring out the bishop and end up with a really good position. We're talking about an opponent who's an expert, so they're probably not going to try to trade these pawns. Now by blocking this bishop, they could play c5, that's true, and they'd be controlling the center. But notice that after the pawn exchange is completed, now we could continue with our game development, for example, by bringing the knight to c3, and here black could choose to castle, and then we could play d4, effectively fixing this pawn right here as a significant weakness for the entire duration of the game. As I told you, a pawn move creates a weakness, And this pawn doesn't have any other pawn that can ever defend it again. So K5, what weakness does it create, so to speak? Well, it means that C6 can never be played again to defend this pawn. So what will our plan be from now on if we reach this position, a position like this? Well, it will be to launch an attack on this specific point here with every single one of our pieces. It could be that instead of this, they don't play the C5 move. Short pause. But let's get the board set up over here. Perfect, we'll set it up like this. As I mentioned, they don't play c5. They might play, for example, b6, which seems like a much better move. The plan doesn't change much. We're gonna exchange this pawn here. And now, notice something. We're gonna play d4, and the position is pretty similar. This pawn will have to advance at some point because if not, it gets left behind. And once it's left behind, we can play rook to c1. We're gonna come in and attack with this rook. We're gonna keep putting pressure on this point. Like I said, it's a pretty balanced position, but with a pretty comfortable plan for the white pieces. We can develop our bishop through d3, or even through here, or e2, castle short, and keep going with our plan. This would be, this would be if black played in a completely precise way. That's something very difficult unless you're playing against players rated around 2400 or 2300. Over 2300, they might play very precisely, but otherwise, this position is pretty tough for black to achieve. Still, like I've been telling you so far, no matter how much you reach this position, our plan is pretty clear. So we're in a position we know, and in a position where we have a clear idea of what to do, and that's very important. Before I finish this first part of the video, which is the part about the white pieces, I'm gonna let you know, stay tuned for tomorrow, because I'll upload the video with the black pieces tomorrow at the usual time, at 2 in the afternoon Spanish time. You can figure out what time that is in your country. You always get a new video at 2 o'clock Spanish time. And here we're gonna look at this game where the black pieces were played by a Grandmaster with a 2500 ELO rating. Impressive. And the white pieces beat him in just 9 moves. You're gonna be blown away. Here, black played f, e5, and white played bishop to b2. Let's go through this a little quickly, attacking this point, which is defended by the knight on c6. So far, everything's normal. c4 from the white pieces, and bishop and knight to f6 from the black pieces. Knight to f3, attacking this point, and they decide to push it forward. You can see that it's attacked by 2 pieces, so they have to find a way to respond to that immediate threat. They decide to push the pawn forward, and the player with the white pieces decides to place their knight on d4. This is a pretty natural square, because their knight is now well defended by the support of the bishop. Black plays bishop to c5, attacking this knight with 2 different pieces. And here, white decides to make a pretty unusual knight jump. And notice that now they're attacking this point here, also taking advantage of this bishop. Black castles, and white simply plays e3 to block this bishop here. d5 from black, attacking this knight. A discovered attack. Notice here, a discovered attack targeting this knight. White decides to recapture. Why? Because if this knight is captured, it would be taken here, and black decides to capture or recapture this knight with d5. And look at what an absolutely spectacular checkmate is coming down on black. The queen moves here, threatening a checkmate. It seems like checkmate is easy to stop at g6. There's no other way. And when they play g6, checkmate with the knight, these 2 squares are covered by the bishop. Notice that the most powerful bishop is the one on b2. This defense can be played both against e4 and d4. Let's analyze e4 in more depth, because it's even more powerful, and besides, it's the main line. e4 is played more often than d4. So let's play the defense, which is b6. It's a defense that seems very passive, very defensive, but on the contrary, it's super aggressive and gives some spectacular results. So let's see how a typical game might continue. They could play d4. Notice that if they started with d4, now they could play e4. Therefore, we would probably reach the same position. Here, we're going to continue with our bishop to b7, which is why we played this b6 move, directly attacking the e4 pawn. So we'd be attacking it right from the start. We'd be attacking from move number 2. So it's not that defensive after all. The most common thing is that they'll defend this pawn we're attacking, for example with knight to c3. And here we'll continue with a very subtle move, which is e6. If you watched yesterday's video about the white pieces, which, by the way, you can find in the description, it's called the hypermodern attack, as I named it. This move with the white pieces was also played e6, with the idea of playing d5 in the future. Here, white could just develop normally, like knight to f3. And here, if you watch the video, we'll play bishop to b4. What's the idea? To pin this knight, notice that here, a lot of people won't realize that this pawn is only defended by this knight. So, for example, they might try to attack your bishop or defend this knight from the pen. We would simply exchange and then capture this pawn, and we'd end up a pawn ahead. A lot of people, more than you might think, fall for this little trap. They don't realize that this pawn is attacked by the bishop. But if they play the correct move, let's see how to continue. The correct response is to defend this pawn, for example with bishop to d3, which is the best solution. In this case, we'll keep developing our pieces and continue putting pressure on the d4 square. Notice that now we have the knight attacking, and we also have the bishop. How can white continue from here? Notice that a lot of people here don't realize the importance of this bishop because it's not the usual move, and many times they just castle or something and end up losing this pawn. First, we would capture here, and then we would take this pawn. What's the correct move here? Obviously, it's to defend this pawn. There's several options, but the most logical is to play around here. We'll also see what happens if they push forward and all that, right? First, let's see what happens if they play queen to e2. Queen to e2 looks like a really good move. It defends this point and puts the queen in a very strong position. After developing the bishop, they could castle either long or short. So it seems like a pretty interesting position. At this point, we're going to break with d5 and put pressure on the center. We're putting massive pressure on the e4 square. Pay attention because we're attacking with this piece, with this one, and also with the bishop. That's why there are now 3 pieces defending, but one of them, the knight, isn't really defending because it's pinned. So here, white has to react. And they have 2 ways to react. One is by advancing this pawn, which is probably the main line, and the other is by capturing this pawn. The important thing to know is that here, white has to react, and if they don't respond immediately to this, they'll end up losing a pawn. Let's analyze all of white's options. Let's start with this pawn advance here, which we've said is the most logical and strategic move, e5. Attacking a knight that can easily jump up here in front. Pay close attention, because now we're putting an incredible amount of pressure on this pen. Notice that now. If it were black's turn again, we could capture this knight, take here, and then capture the pawn, and here we'd take the rook. So white's response has to be immediate, unless, they want to lose the game right away, right? What happens if they try to capture this annoying knight? Well, we would simply recapture and force this knight to move, and then we'd capture this pawn. For example, if the knight moves away, we capture this pawn. And many of you might say, well, here the knight can also escape through this square here. And now, after exchanging pawns, I just take this one here, and that's it. Nothing happened here. Well, something did happen, my friend. Because if you don't realize it, this king and this knight is pinned. So you just take the knight, and now you're left with an extra piece. No matter how many queens get exchanged, you'll still have a material advantage here. So if we go back a bit, we see that capturing with bishop takes knight isn't possible. Instead of this, they're going to try to defend against the pin with bishop to d2. Here, we need to consider different options. We could capture the bishop and end up with the advantage of having the bishop pair while our opponent doesn't, but we actually have an even better move, which is to give up our own bishop pair. Give up, in quotes, because notice that now if they capture with the bishop, we could recapture, and if they capture with the pawn, we could also capture on d2. So it's a temporary concession, for now. We could get it back whenever we want. Let's look at both options. First, if they take with the bishop, here, what we could simply do is capture this point here, and now, after the recapture, play c5. What are we threatening with c5? Well, first, we're gaining space, and if white doesn't notice and, for example, makes a normal move like castling, after the move c4, this bishop is completely lost. We have also previously seen this same pattern in the opening while playing with the white pieces. So let's see. Instead of capturing with the bishop, what exactly happens if they decide to capture with the pawn? In that case, let's consider what we need to do. We would play c5 in the same way as before. And here, after a move like, as we said, castling by white, let's see what we have here. We currently have an extremely strong and well-placed knight right in the center of the board. This powerful knight is definitely going to become our opponent's single biggest headache. We could continue, for example, with the knight over here, putting pressure in the center of the board. Even this bishop, which is so good, not right now, but in the future, we could come up with a plan to trade these bishops. So here, the advantage is slightly in our favor. Also, white's pawn structure isn't drastic yet, but it's something we could take advantage of in the future. Notice as well that the same option as before exists here. If this knight is such a headache, why can't I just capture it? Now this pawn is defended, so look at what happens here. After the capture, we're threatening this knight with the pawn, and next we'll capture this pawn because we have two pieces attacking it. And just like before, if they try to come here, defended by the bishop to attack this pawn, after the exchanges, pay attention, after the exchanges, what happens? Instead of capturing here, they capture here. And we have this spectacular move. Bishop, queen, knight. If they move away, it's checkmate. So they can't move away, and a lot of people fall into this trap. They move the knight that's under attack, and they simply get checkmated. But if they attempt to defend this pawn, for example, with a perfectly standard looking move like pawn to f3 here, what happens if they play f3 here? Well, we just take this pawn and keep the advantage we already had. Now we're threatening this pawn. However, here we have a completely winning advantage. We're also threatening to play f5, putting pressure on this knight that's pinned because the queen is behind it, and so on. Let's go back to the beginning then, where we played b6, and here they take the center with d4. Quickly, what we need to do is play bishop to b7 to directly attack the e5 square. The most popular move is knight to c3, without a doubt. Although it's much better if you're playing with the black pieces to play bishop to d3. That's a much more precise move. Still, nobody plays bishop to d3. Everyone defends this pawn with knight to c3. How are we going to continue if they respond with knight to c3? Well, if you've been paying attention to the video, you'll know that the right move here is to play e6. e6 is a good candidate to support d5, and to maintain a pretty solid pawn structure that doesn't create many weaknesses. So after e6, you already know the game could continue in many ways. For example, knight to f3. How are we going to continue if they play knight to f3? We'll pin this other knight here. Remember that this bishop is super powerful. If we take advantage of the pin, now we're threatening this square indirectly, so it has to be defended. And here, what we'll do is simply attack it with the other knight. What did we see before? That they defended it with the queen and we played d5. I told you there were two options here, advance the pawn or capture. We just saw a moment ago what happens if they advance the pawn. Now let's see what happens if they capture this pawn from us. Let's think about how to recapture it. I'll give you 3 seconds to think about which piece you'd use to recapture. There it is. You could recapture with the pawn, with the knight, with the bishop, or what I recommend, with the queen. Very interesting. Notice that here they can't capture your queen because this knight is pinned, so you can forget about that. We have a super interesting queen right here in the middle of the board, giving us some absolutely spectacular options to launch brutal attacks with this bishop. Here, the white pieces can continue, for example, by castling, which would be a very logical move. And here we have several options ourselves. We have 2 candidate moves. I'm going to explain one in case you want to make the middle game a bit more complicated, and another to simplify the game for yourself. If you want to get into a bit more complications and you want a more complex game, you should castle. And here, if you want to simplify and get a good position that's a bit easier to play, you bring your queen over here and force your opponent to trade queens. Why is that, chess teacher? Well, because we're attacking this knight with both the bishop and the queen. So here, any other move would be followed by bishop takes knight, queen takes, and this gap would open up near the king. So here, they have to try not to double their pawns by moving this knight. Once they move the knight, we simply trade queens and look at what a comfortable endgame this is to play. For example, we could continue with knight to b7. It's an easy endgame to play with a really solid pawn structure, a very, very good endgame with a slight advantage for black. You could even trade this knight here to double their pawns, and you'd have a slightly better endgame for yourself. And that's pretty good, considering we started with the black pieces. So if you don't want any complications, you know what to do. Trade here, bring your knight over this way. You can even castle either kingside or queenside. Right now, queenside isn't an option because of this over here, but maybe in the future, and just play the game. Pay attention, because this is a very dangerous line. When we just brought out the knight to attack this square here, we talked about what happens when they play queen to e2 to defend this point. If you've been paying attention, you know that here you have to play d5. But now let's look at a slightly more aggressive response from the white pieces. They don't have to play queen to e2. There are plenty of other options, and I'm going to explain how to defend against one of them. Not just how to defend, but how to come out ahead in a situation that looks like a clear win for white, which is e5. Pay attention, because here they're threatening our knight, and in a pretty strong way, right? Because they're putting a pawn directly on e5, which is already restricting us a bit, and here we might not really know what to do. Should we bring the knight over here or over there? Well, pay attention, because here the best move is knight to e4, and we're going to analyze it in depth. Right now, this knight is extremely strong in the center of the board. If they trade this bishop for this knight, they're giving up their best piece. Remember that this knight can't be captured because it's pinned by the king. So this knight here becomes an extremely strong piece. How can white respond? Well, it seems that the most obvious answer, besides capturing this knight, which leads to several problems, would be to play, for example, bishop to d2, trying to get out of the pin. Does that seem like a good idea? Well, it seems like an idea that saves everything and that nothing bad will happen here. But let me show you how to continue, because we have some extremely dangerous options for us here. The first thing we need to do is take advantage of the fact that our opponent is going to lose one of their bishops no matter what, and we're going to take advantage of that to win the bishop pair. How? By directly capturing the bishop on d2 with our knight. Here, obviously, they're going to recapture with the queen, since moving their knight back wouldn't be a valid option, and even less so with their king. Recapturing with the queen seems like the best option. And then, look, our bishops are putting a ton of pressure on the opponent's side. We could also, so to speak, sacrifice our bishop pair for this knight here, since that would damage their pawn structure. And from here, we could continue in many different ways. We could attack over here, but what I recommend is bringing your queen here. Look at the pressure you're putting on their castled position. You're also putting incredible pressure on the d4 square. The queen comes in, and now the knight follows. The pressure is multiplied 1,000 times over. How can they defend his pawn? Notice there are very few ways to defend this pawn. It seems like the most obvious move of all, placing the bishop on the e4 square. Why? Because not only does it defend against this attack, but at the same time, it also attacks this rook over here. How could we continue? Well, obviously, we would continue with a move we were gonna make anyway. You've probably already guessed it, would be knight to f6. It seems like a very, very obvious move. They can't come this way because they'd be giving up their last bishop, the only one they have left, and it's also their good bishop. So we assume they make a completely normal move, like castling. We castle as well. Let's see how the game continues after all these normal, everyday moves. Here, simply, how could we continue? Well, pay attention, because we could continue with some moves, for example, here or here, freeing ourselves a bit from the pressure of this pawn that's got us a little suffocated. Notice that this is a good way to get rid of all this pressure. For example, here they could play king to b1. It would seem like a super logical move to put the king in a better position. We would continue with e5, attacking this bishop, which can't move because then the e4 pawn would be left undefended. So this bishop can't move. It would have to capture en passant, and after the en passant capture, we would recapture with the rook, and pay attention to the absolutely brutal pressure coming from the rook. There's also pressure coming from the knight on this square. There could be pinning tactics here, because of the queen. This other pin, this queen, can also come in to attack after a move like this. So here, black's position is incredibly advantageous, and we end up with a tremendous advantage. And finally, let's look at a super interesting line. We've seen what happens with queen to e2. We respond with d5. We've seen what happens with e5, where we respond with the move knight to e4. And now let's look at a very logical move from white as well, which would be to pin our knight. If you pin my knight, I'll pin yours. But that's not a good idea, because we can quickly react with the move h6. And here we're already asking that bishop, what do you want to do? Capture or retreat? If it retreats, we simply play b5, trapping it back there, and now we could capture this pawn here, since it's no longer defended by the knight, only by the bishop, and we're defending it as well. Therefore, we would have an extra pawn. If it doesn't retreat and decides to capture the knight, then we would thank them because they're directly giving us the bishop pair. And generally, in this position, that's an advantage for us. We'll capture with the green, but make sure not to capture with the pawn because you'd end up with a very bad pawn structure, obviously. We'll capture with the queen, queen takes on f6, and now let's see how to continue. We have a structure with both bishops that look like two assassins. We have a very, very good position, although it doesn't necessarily mean we're better. Maybe we have a slight advantage because we have the bishop pair. Let's suppose white castles, which is a completely normal move. Why is it normal for us here? Because they're already getting out of the pin. We could trade without any problem, right? This knight here, because by recapturing, we'd be damaging our opponent's pawn structure, and we'd end up quite a bit better. What's our plan? Our plan is to play d6 for two reasons. We have the light squared bishop, so just in case you didn't know, let me give you some advice. If you have a bishop on the light squares, place your pawns on the dark squares, and your bishop will work much better, much more freely across the board. Notice that if they were on the dark squares, this bishop wouldn't make any sense. And the other reason is so we can bring out this knight over here without blocking the bishop's diagonal. Here, in this game, white played a move like rook to e1, and we could simply continue with knight to d7 and be completely comfortable. A very, very good position. A lot of you might be thinking, what happens if here, for example, well, they play rook to e1? Obviously, in case you didn't know, it's so we can push this pawn here, right? No. I guess you would have figured that out by now. Let's suppose that here, for example, after rook to e1, we castle, and then say queen to e2 comes to support this square here, right? We simply block off this square. Notice that we cut off the entire attack and end up with a spectacular bishop that attacks the d4 square, which, as you know, is one of the most important focal points of attack in this opening, or this defense in this case. I'll also say, the opponent's bishop looks like just another pawn, because here it can't do anything. It can't move forward or backward, and it doesn't have any attacking lines here. So here we would end up in a much better position. If instead of playing this queen, let's set up the situation. This is like this is like this, sorry. And instead of playing this queen over here, they directly push a pawn trying to bother you a bit. What you need to do is simply pull your queen back to e7. Nothing has happened here, and the position is still really, really good for you. A bishop with an open diagonal, a queen that's safe, will simply develop the knight through d7 and end up in a pretty interesting position. I'm leaving yesterday's video in the description, showing how to play b3 with the white pieces because it was amazing. And that's it for today's video. I hope you really enjoyed this video. Leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.